In a world where empires rose on glory and buried their sins in silence, this channel opens the doors history tried to erase. Here, we don't tell the stories you learned in school. We uncover the rituals, the betrayals, the forbidden truths carved into palace walls. Every video is a descent into power, fear, and the dark secrets of kings, queens, and forgotten victims. So if you're ready to witness the side of history they tried to erase, subscribe to this channel so we can stay connected. Be sure to like the video and step into the shadows with us, where the real past still breathes. Tonight, you are not entering a story. You are walking into a chamber Rome tried to erase from history. A place where sacred girls worshipped like goddesses were led in silence and never seen again. No execution, no blood, just earth, closing slowly above their breathing bodies, while priests called it holy justice. But one name refused to stay buried: Cornelia Maximilla. Chosen at 6, revered for 21 years, then condemned in a trial where innocence meant nothing, and politics meant everything. What happened to her beneath that sealed chamber was so terrifying, Rome buried the truth along with her. And tonight you will hear it. Every hidden ritual, every forbidden punishment, every secret they prayed history would forget. The door that opens once the torches die first, then the noise of Rome, because some doors don't lead to prison, only to forgetting. And tonight, a sacred girl learns she was never meant to survive. Cornelia Maximilla is 27 years old when the city decides she must disappear. Not executed, never that. Rome cannot spill the blood of a Vestal Virgin, not without staining itself. So the priests choose a cleaner cruelty, the kind that lets them sleep. They lead her through darkness toward a corridor that hasn't been used in 43 years, a passage older than the men guiding her, older than the emperor's throne, older than the lies they call law. She wears white, the same white she has worn since childhood, the color of purity, the color of property. She has been sacred since she was 6 years old, selected like a prize from the daughters of powerful families and carried away from her mothers, arms to live beside the forum. People used to look at her like she was a living talisman, the city's luck wrapped in human skin. They bowed, they stepped aside, they feared her blessing and her curse. But none of that follows her into this tunnel. In here, she is only a body walking toward a sealed room. The stone beneath her bare feet is cold and smooth, polished by centuries of ordinary footsteps, but only a handful of those footsteps belonged to women coming this way. The air smells like earth and old moisture and something sealed too long, like a tomb that remembers every breath it has stolen. She can't see the walls, yet she feels them close in. She can't see the steps, yet she senses the drop with each careful movement. The priest's hands grip her arms with practiced certainty. They do not tremble. They have done this before, even if their fathers did it last. She tries to breathe quietly, like a good Vestal should, like a woman trained to never appear messy, never appear afraid, never give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. But her lungs betray her. Her breaths scrape, loud against the stone, echoing back at her, as if the corridor is already mocking her. She whispers that she is innocent, not as a plea, more like a reflex, the last rule her mind can cling to. I have never violated my vows, she says. I have never touched any man. No one answers, because innocence is not what brought her here. The accusation has already done its work. A confession has been extracted from a man under torture, and in Rome, pain can be made to speak any language. Slaves have testified for the promise of freedom, and in Rome, truth is often just a currency. A trial has been staged like a ritual, formal words, solemn faces, and a verdict that existed before the first question was asked. The Pontifex Maximus has declared her polluted. The emperor has signed his approval. And now the city will pretend she dies naturally, as if the gods reached down and closed her throat themselves. This is Rome's genius. It turns violence into ceremony, then calls it holiness. The corridor ends with a door that opens only once. Cornelia feels it before she sees it, the change in air, the shift in echo, the silence that thickens like cloth. A priest begins to chant in old Latin, the kind of archaic phrasing that sounds less like comfort and more like paperwork addressed to the underworld. The words do not pray for her. They protect Rome. They absolve the hands that will seal her in. They transfer responsibility to the gods, so no living man must admit what he is doing. The door creaks open, and a thin glow spills out one lamp, one flame, small enough to feel insulting. Beyond it is a chamber carved into the earth, a couch, a jug of water, a bit of bread, a small measure of oil. Not mercy, just a legal trick. Enough to survive for days, so her death can be called natural, even as the air slowly becomes poison. Cornelia steps inside, and the ceiling seems to drop closer than she expected. She cannot stand fully upright. The walls press in like a fist. The lamp's light makes shadows that stretch and shiver, like the room is alive and hungry. She turns back, and the priests are already withdrawing. The door begins to close with the calm finality of men who believe their righteousness is unbreakable. "I am innocent," she says again, louder now, and the words crack raw and hoarse. For a heartbeat, she imagines someone hesitating, someone admitting doubt, someone opening the door and pulling her out. But Rome does not hesitate when it needs a sacrifice. Stone meets stone. The sound is absolute. Then comes the dull, muffled thud of earth being poured over head soil, sealing the entrance, burying her existence as neatly as her body. The lamp flickers, and Cornelia realizes the cruelest part isn't the darkness. The cruelest part is the truth she finally understands, alone in that shrinking air. She wasn't condemned because she broke her vow. She was condemned because someone powerful needed the city to fear something. And she was the easiest holy thing to destroy. And as the last noises of Rome fade into silence, Cornelia Maximilla sits on the couch, staring into the trembling flame, and waits to discover what kind of death a pure girl is allowed to have. Child taken, city protected, she was not chosen. She was claimed. Because Rome did not ask girls to serve its gods. It took them. And once taken, they no longer belonged to their families. Only to fear. Cornelia Maximilla was 6 years old the day her childhood ended, though no one used words like ending. They called it honor. They called it blessing. They called it destiny. The Pontifex Maximus himself stood before a gathering of Rome's elite families, his voice heavy with ritual authority, announcing that the goddess Vesta required a new servant. That meant one thing somewhere among the daughters of Rome's most powerful houses. A child would be taken and turned into something sacred and untouchable. Fathers pushed forward eagerly. Mothers hid their dread behind practiced smiles. Because having a daughter chosen as a Vestal Virgin meant prestige that no political office could rival. The girl would be freed from her father's legal control. She could own wealth, command servants, walk the streets with a status that even senators respected. Her presence alone could pardon condemned criminals. She would sit in the best seats at games, draped in white, watched by thousands who believed her purity protected the entire empire. But Cornelia did not understand prestige. She understood only that strangers were examining her teeth, her posture, her speech, her body looking for flaws that might displease the gods. She had to be perfect. No limp, no stutter, no scar, because the girl chosen would not just serve religion. She would symbolize Rome's divine favor. Imperfection meant risk, and Rome did not gamble with its survival. When her name was drawn, the room erupted in applause. Her father wept not from sorrow, but pride. Her mother knelt, kissing her head as if she were already leaving for another world. Cornelia herself did not cry until later, when the ceremony ended and she realized she was not going home. She would never go home again, not truly. The moment she was selected, she stopped belonging to her bloodline. She now belonged to the goddess. The house of the Vestals stood beside the Roman Forum, vast and luxurious, filled with gardens, fountains, marble halls, and statues of the women who had served before. To the outside world, it looked like paradise. To a 6-year-old child, it felt like exile wrapped in gold. Older Vestals greeted her with serene smiles, their faces calm in the way of women who had long ago buried their personal selves beneath ritual discipline. Training began immediately. Cornelia learned how to tend the sacred flame, the fire believed to hold Rome's fate within its glow. If it ever went out, disasters would follow: plagues, invasions, collapse. That belief pressed on her shoulders long before she was strong enough to carry it. She memorized prayers older than the Republic, rituals performed in exact sequence, sacred substances only Vestals were allowed to touch. But the most important lesson was not ritual. It was fear. Virginity, in Rome's eyes, was not simply physical. It was spiritual, symbolic, political. Cornelia was taught that her untouched body was a barrier between Rome and divine punishment. If she were corrupted, the gods themselves might abandon the empire. That meant every glance, every word, every proximity to a man was scrutinized. Servants watched, attendants reported. Even other Vestals observed each other, because suspicion was a duty, not a betrayal. Rumors alone could destroy a life. Stories circulated among the novices whispered lessons disguised as warnings. They spoke of Vestals who had been accused of incestum, the sacred crime of broken chastity. Girls who had walked down corridors beneath the earth. Girls who had been sealed away alive. The elders spoke calmly when telling these stories, but their eyes hardened as if memory itself frightened them. Cornelia listened and built her existence around avoidance. She lowered her gaze when men passed. She spoke only when required. She moved like a shadow in ceremonial white. Years passed, then decades. She rose through the ranks, eventually becoming Virgo Maxima, the chief Vestal, the most revered woman in Rome's religious order. From the outside, her life looked untouchable. But prestige in Rome was never protection, it was exposure. Because the higher a Vestal rose, the more valuable she became politically. Her reputation could legitimize emperors. Her downfall could distract the public. And in times of crisis, Rome needed spectacles strong enough to restore belief that the gods were still watching. Cornelia did not realize that the privileges surrounding her were not shields. They were stakes driven into the ground, binding her to a system that could destroy her the moment it required proof of its own righteousness. And far above the sacred house where she once walked as Rome's living symbol of purity, powerful men had already begun whispering her name for reasons that had nothing to do with vows at all. The crime that wasn't about desire, Rome did not fear a Vestal sin. It feared what her sin symbolized. Because if her body was corrupted, the empire believed its destiny was too. And so truth mattered less than the terror her accusation could create. The word was incestum, a term spoken in hushed tones, heavier than treason, darker than murder. To Rome, it did not simply mean broken chastity. It meant sacred pollution, a spiritual contamination capable of infecting the entire city, angering the gods, weakening Rome's divine protection. When a Vestal was accused of incestum, the charge did not belong to her alone. It belonged to the fate of the empire itself. That belief is what made the accusation so powerful and so dangerous. Cornelia Maximilla first heard the whisper weeks before the arrest. Not spoken directly to her, of course. Vestals were never confronted like ordinary citizens. Instead, the air around her shifted. Conversations died when she entered rooms. Servants lowered their eyes too quickly. Even fellow Vestals women she had lived beside for decades watched her with a quiet distance, as though fear itself required physical space. Rumors in Rome never needed evidence. They needed usefulness. The name tied to her accusation was Valerius Lysianus, a man she had spoken to perhaps 3 times in her life, always in public ceremonies, always surrounded by witnesses. There had been no secret meetings, no exchanged letters, no stolen moments. Yet suddenly, the narrative existed as if it had always been real. The chief Vestal and her hidden lover, purity corrupted, Rome endangered. Valerius disappeared first. When he reappeared, he was no longer the same man. Torture had reshaped him. His confession written, signed, proclaimed described meetings that never happened, touches that never occurred, betrayals invented between screams. Pain had carved a story into his mouth, and Rome accepted it because it needed to. Slaves followed, witnesses produced as if from shadows. They testified they had seen gestures, glances, improprieties. Freedom had been promised in exchange for truth, or something Rome could call truth. The testimonies aligned too perfectly, like lines rehearsed for a performance whose ending was already scripted. Cornelia was summoned to the religious court soon after. Unlike secular trials, this was not a place for defense. The chamber was filled with priests, ritual officials, and at its center the Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious authority in Rome. His presence alone told her everything. When the chief priest presided personally, the outcome was never uncertain. The proceedings were wrapped in ceremony prayers, invocations, sacred formulas, but beneath the ritual language, the structure was brutally simple. She was accused. Evidence was recited. Confessions were read aloud. Witnesses spoke without challenge. She was permitted to answer, but her words carried no equal weight. "I am innocent," she said, her voice steady despite the eyes fixed upon her. She invoked Vesta herself as witness, calling upon the goddess she had served since childhood. In any ordinary crime, such a declaration might demand investigation. Here, it changed nothing, because incestum trials were never about proving guilt. They were about restoring fear. Rome was entering a period of instability, military disappointments, economic strain, whispers of imperial weakness. The emperor needed reassurance to display, a signal to the public that divine order was intact. Condemning a Vestal, especially the chief Vestal, sent a message stronger than any military parade. If Rome punished its most sacred women, surely the gods would see its devotion. Cornelia realized this slowly as the trial unfolded, not through evidence, but through atmosphere. The lack of tension, the absence of uncertainty. The way verdict language had already been inscribed before deliberation even began. She was not standing in judgment. She was standing inside a ritual sacrifice. When the Pontifex Maximus finally spoke, his tone carried the weight of inevitability rather than decision. He declared her body polluted, her vow broken, her sacred status revoked. The words did not rage, they finalized, like sealing wax over a document already signed by power itself. The sentence followed ancient law: death without bloodshed, burial beneath the earth, a ritual designed to remove pollution without staining Rome's hands. As priests escorted her from the chamber, Cornelia searched their faces, not for mercy, but doubt. She found none, because belief protected them. They believed the ritual preserved Rome. They believed her destruction served divine balance. And belief, when fused with authority, becomes more merciless than hatred. That night, as preparations began for the underground chamber, Cornelia understood the most terrifying truth of all. She had not been condemned because Rome proved she was guilty. She had been condemned because Rome needed someone sacred enough that destroying her would make the city feel safe again. The trial that was never meant to save her. The court was sacred, but not just. Every prayer spoken inside it protected Rome, not the accused. And Cornelia walked in already condemned. She just hadn't heard the words yet. The day of the formal judgment arrived, wrapped in ritual silence. No public spectacle, no shouting crowds. Vestal trials were never chaotic. They were controlled, deliberate, almost surgical in their cold precision. Cornelia Maximilla was brought not to a criminal court, but to a consecrated chamber reserved for religious violations crimes believed to wound the gods themselves. The air inside smelled of incense and old parchment. Oil lamps flickered against marble walls, engraved with prayers meant to purify judgment. But Cornelia felt no purification here. Only suffocation? The kind that comes when outcomes are decided before voices are heard. The Pontifex Maximus presided from an elevated seat carved of pale stone, draped in ceremonial robes that symbolized Rome's direct authority from the divine. Beneath him stood a council of priestsmen whose faces showed discipline rather than curiosity. They were not here to investigate. They were here to affirm what power had already chosen. Cornelia was placed at the center of the chamber. No chains, no visible restraints. Vestals were too sacred to be bound like criminals. But the illusion of dignity only deepened the cruelty, because while her body stood unchained, her fate was already sealed tighter than iron. The charges were recited in archaic Latin, formal and distant, as if describing a ritual defect rather than a human life. Violation of sacred chastity, pollution of divine service, endangerment of Rome's covenant with Vesta. Each phrase struck heavier than the last, not because of evidence, but because of what they implied. Rome itself had been threatened. Valerius Lysianus' confession was read aloud. The words were too detailed describing meetings, touches, betrayals that Cornelia knew had never happened. She watched the parchment tremble slightly in the priest's hands as he read, not from doubt, but from the weight of the narrative they were reinforcing. Witnesses followed, slaves brought forward one by one. Their testimonies echoed each other with unnatural precision, glances exchanged, footsteps heard at night, suspicions that had grown into certainty. Cornelia recognized none of their stories as reality, yet she understood the mechanism perfectly. Freedom had been purchased with her destruction. When it was her turn to speak, the chamber grew quieter, not out of respect, but expectation. A Vestal's defense was never meant to dismantle accusation. It was meant to fulfill procedure. She stepped forward, white robes falling like a funeral shroud, and raised her voice not to the priests, but to the goddess she had served since childhood. "I call upon Vesta as witness," she said. "I have remained pure in body and in soul. I have not broken my vow." The words hung in the air. In another setting, invoking a deity might demand divine consultation, omens, delays. But here, the invocation dissolved without effect. Because the trial was not seeking divine input, it was demonstrating divine enforcement. The Pontifex Maximus did not ask questions. He did not probe contradictions. He did not challenge testimonies. His silence functioned like confirmation. And in that silence, Cornelia felt the final illusion collapse. This was not a trial. It was a performance of moral authority staged for Rome's stability. Beyond the chamber, the empire trembled under political strain. Military disappointments had shaken confidence. Economic pressures stirred unrest. The emperor required reassurance proof that Rome still commanded divine favor. And punishing sacred corruption was the most theatrical reassurance possible. If a Vestal could be judged, condemned, and removed, the gods must still be listening. When the verdict was spoken, it came without deliberation. Cornelia Maximilla, Virgo Maxima, is found guilty of incestum. Her sacred protection is revoked. She shall be removed beneath the earth, according to ancient law. No outrage followed, no gasp. The priests bowed their heads as if witnessing necessary maintenance rather than human destruction. Cornelia felt the words settle, not like shock, but inevitability. As if some part of her had sensed this ending from the moment rumors first whispered her name. As attendants approached to escort her away, she searched the chamber one last time, not for rescue, but humanity. A flicker of doubt, a hesitation. A sign that someone recognized the machinery grinding her into sacrifice. She found none, because belief shielded them. They believed the ritual protected Rome. They believed her death would restore divine harmony. They believed necessity purified cruelty. And belief, when institutionalized, becomes unchallengeable violence. As she was led from the chamber toward preparation rites, Cornelia understood the final structure of the system that had raised her, honored her, and now erased her. She had never been judged as a woman. She had been judged as a symbol. And symbols, when they become inconvenient, are destroyed without hesitation. Behind her, priests began reciting purification prayers, not for her soul, but for the city that had just condemned its most sacred servant to die. Buried alive, so Rome could feel pure, they would not spill her blood, because sacred blood polluted the earth. So they chose a holier cruelty one that let her die slowly beneath it. And Rome called this mercy. The execution of a Vestal Virgin never resembled ordinary death. There were no blades, no ropes, no public violence. Rome could not risk divine contamination by shedding the blood of a woman sworn to Vesta. Instead, it constructed rituals so calculated, so ceremonially detached, that murder could pass as religious duty. At dawn, Cornelia Maximilla was dressed not for burial, but for transition. Her robes were ceremonial white, layered with funerary garments beneath, symbolizing both priestess and corpse. A veil covered her face, not to preserve modesty, but to silence her humanity. Vestals were not meant to be heard during condemnation. Their suffering would exist, but privately, invisibly, beneath the narrative of sacred justice. She was placed inside a covered litter, carried through Rome's streets. The city did not gather to jeer. This was not spectacle in the common sense. The atmosphere was heavier, uneasy, reverent, fearful. Citizens watched in silence as the procession passed, torches flickering despite daylight. Some lowered their heads. Others stared, unable to reconcile the contradiction. Rome's most sacred woman being led toward a punishment reserved for pollution. Because if a Vestal could fall, what did that mean for Rome itself? The procession moved toward the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness, a sight just inside the Colline Gate. The name alone carried centuries of dread. It was here, beneath unmarked soil, that condemned Vestals had been sealed away for generations. No monuments marked their graves. No inscriptions recorded their names. Sacred women erased without trace. A chamber had already been prepared. Small, narrow, subterranean, excavated deep enough to isolate corruption from the living world. Inside, priests had arranged the legal necessities: a couch, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, a lamp, a small measure of oil. The provisions were not compassion, they were ritual fiction. Enough sustenance to claim she died naturally, rather than by Roman hands. This was Rome's moral loophole. The Pontifex Maximus himself presided over the final rites. As Cornelia was brought forward, the veil lifted briefly, not for comfort, but identification. Witnesses had to confirm that the sacred body being removed was truly the condemned Vestal. Her face, pale but composed, showed neither hysteria nor pleading. Vestal training had carved discipline into her bones, even now. A ladder descended into the chamber. Before stepping down, Cornelia's robe caught slightly against the wood. An attendant instinctively reached to help her, but she recoiled sharply from his touch. Even now, at the threshold of death, she guarded the vow she had been accused of breaking. The gesture rippled through the priests watching above. Some recorded it later, disturbed by the contradiction it suggested. But contradiction did not halt ritual. Cornelia descended alone. Each step lowered her deeper into air that smelled of sealed earth and ancient suffocation. The chamber was smaller than imagined, barely enough to contain the couch. The ceiling forced her to bow her head, as if the architecture itself demanded submission. She stepped onto the floor. Above her, priests began chanting transfer rites formulas, absolving Rome of responsibility. The words declared that she was no longer under Vesta's protection, that she had been delivered to the judgment of the underworld gods. that what followed was divine will, not human decision. The ladder was withdrawn. For a moment, light from the entrance framed her silhouette white robes against darkness. Then the covering stone slid into place. The sound echoed with finality so absolute it seemed to erase sound itself. Then came the earth, heavy, relentless, pouring over the sealed entrance until no trace remained. Soil muffled the last connection between her and the living world. Above ground, priests completed purification prayers, ensuring Rome remained spiritually intact after removing its pollution. Below ground, Cornelia stood alone beside a single lamp. She examined the chamber with slow, deliberate breaths. Bread, water, oil, calculated survival. She understood immediately. The provisions were not meant to sustain life, only to prolong awareness of death's approach. The lamp flame trembled in the still air, casting distorted shadows that made the walls appear to breathe. She sat on the couch, feeling the earth's weight pressing from every side. The silence was not absence. It was pressure, a living force closing inward. Hours would pass before oxygen thinned. Days before dehydration claimed her. Or madness born from isolation and darkness might come first. Rome had engineered every variable, balancing ritual purity with psychological torment. Above her, the empire resumed its rhythm. Markets reopened. Senators debated policy. Citizens spoke of divine justice restored. No one spoke of the woman beneath the soil. As the lamp flickered lower, Cornelia Maximilla understood the final cruelty of her fate. She had not been buried because Rome hated her. She had been buried because Rome believed her death proved its righteousness. And as the flame shrank, the chamber darkened not suddenly, but slowly enough to let her watch the light abandon her, just as the world above already had. What Rome wanted buried with her, the chamber did not only hold a dying woman, it held a civilization's secret. Because when the earth closed over Cornelia, Rome believed the truth closed with it. But some horrors refused to stay buried, even after 2,000 years. Long after the lamp inside Cornelia Maximilla's chamber extinguished, Rome moved on. Above ground, life resumed with mechanical indifference. Senators argued policy. Soldiers marched. Merchants shouted across markets. Priests performed rituals beside the sacred flame, as if nothing had been disturbed. Official records described the event in sterile language. Purification completed, pollution removed, divine balance restored. The phrasing was deliberate, crafted to preserve Rome's image of moral order. No record described her fear. No inscription marked her grave. No prayer mourned her death. Because Vestals condemned for incestum were not meant to be remembered. Memory implied doubt. Doubt implied injustice. And injustice threatened the very authority Rome had tried to reinforce through her destruction. So the system erased its victims. Names vanished from public monuments. Personal histories dissolved into silence. Even the chambers themselves were buried deliberately, hidden beneath layers of soil, so no passerby would be reminded what sacred punishment truly meant. Rome celebrated Vestals in marble when they served, and erased them into anonymity when they fell. But history does not always obey erasure. Centuries later, archaeologists excavating near the ancient Colline Gate uncovered subterranean structures matching descriptions from fragmented Roman texts, narrow chambers, sealed from above, deliberately constructed, then filled with earth. No inscriptions, no ceremonial markings. Just empty suffocation preserved in architecture. The absence of remains did not disprove the burials, it confirmed their design. Bodies sealed in such conditions, beneath centuries of urban development, left little recoverable trace. Yet the chambers themselves stood as silent testimony. Rome had not exaggerated its rituals. It had engineered them with precision. The archaeological discovery unsettled historians for a reason deeper than structural confirmation. It stripped away Rome's rhetorical shield. For centuries, Vestal punishments had been discussed academically, ritualistically distanced by language that framed burial alive as symbolic purification rather than prolonged execution. But standing inside one of those excavated chambers, even modern observers felt the psychological compression. The ceiling pressed low enough to prevent full posture. The walls narrowed space until breath felt rationed. The absence of light felt absolute even at midday. It became impossible to call the punishment ceremonial once its physical reality was experienced. And this realization forced a darker reassessment of Rome itself. The civilization that engineered aqueducts, codified law, and built architectural marvels had also perfected ritualized psychological execution. The same society that praised Vestals as living symbols of divine protection had constructed systems that allowed their destruction to serve political necessity. The contradiction was not accidental, it was structural. Vestal privilege existed precisely to make their punishment meaningful. A woman stripped of status could not restore public faith through condemnation. But a revered priestess publicly honored, legally independent, symbolically sacred could. Her fall reinforced fear. Her burial dramatized the cost of divine disfavor. The system required both reverence and terror. Cornelia Maximilla's execution under Emperor Domitian illustrated the mechanism perfectly. Ancient historians, particularly Pliny the Younger, recorded widespread belief in her innocence. Yet the emperor proceeded regardless, needing moral spectacle to stabilize a politically strained reign. Her death restored imperial authority, not through justice, but theater, and this pattern repeated across Roman history. Vestal trials clustered during periods of instability, military failure, economic distress, political transition. Sacred prosecution functioned as psychological governance. By punishing divine corruption, emperors reassured the populace that Rome's cosmic order remained intact. The Vestals themselves became instruments of political oxygen sacrificed to replenish public belief. Christianity's rise in the 4th century finally ended the institution. Emperor Theodosius I abolished the Vestals, extinguished the sacred flame, and dismantled Rome's pagan priesthoods. The final Vestals were released, not buried, but their millennium-long system vanished almost overnight. Yet abolition did not bring retrospective justice. Christian chroniclers dismissed Vestals as relics of pagan superstition rather than examining the human cost of their punishments. Modern scholarship often repeated the pattern, focusing on Vestal privilege, legal autonomy, and ceremonial prestige, while reducing burial alive to sensational footnote. But the chambers beneath Rome refuse footnote status. They remain physical reminders that civilization's grandeur and brutality often coexist. That moral systems capable of inspiring awe can also justify horror when collective stability demands sacrifice. Cornelia's story survives not because Rome preserved it, but because fragments slipped through historical suppression. Trial accounts, senatorial letters, archaeological confirmations. Enough evidence remains to reconstruct the truth Rome preferred buried, that its sacred women were both honored and hostage. And as modern observers look back across 2 millennia, the final reflection becomes unavoidable. Rome believed burying one innocent woman could restore divine favor, stabilize politics, and protect civilization. The ritual worked at least symbolically. The empire endured centuries longer. But the chamber beneath the earth preserved a different legacy, one not of protection, but warning. Because civilizations are not judged only by what they build above ground, but by what they are willing to bury beneath it to survive.